What if I told you about a war where the invading side greatly outnumbered the defenders with superior technology and air superiority, where the battles were won, but in the end, the war lost? The Soviet-Afghan War is perhaps the most undercovered, yet equally influential conflict of the 20th century. Its consequences have impacted the eventual fall of the Soviet Union, and perhaps even one of the most catastrophic events in our modern age. This is the story of how a small force of rural farmers ended up beating the absolute military giant that was the Soviet Union. The year is 1978, and Afghanistan is in chaos. Several political coups, assassinations, and protests had occurred due to civil unrest in the country. The Soviets, fearing an Islamic uprising and revolution, decided it was best if they stepped in and took control of the situation. So on the 24th of December 1979, 30,000 Soviet troops marched into Afghanistan in order to topple the government. One of the key motivations for the invasion was also the fear of a Muslim domino effect taking place in the region. The thought was that if Afghanistan went through a revolution, then perhaps it would spread all the way up to Turkmenistan or even Uzbekistan. Uncannily, this was a similar reason to why America chose to invade Vietnam, the only difference being that the purpose was to stop communism and not Islam. The consequences were that many rural farmers and regular people took up the fight against the now common secular invader. In a certain way, this became a sort of cultural struggle for the now strongly religious Afghans, or as we in the West call it, a jihad or holy war. And this is how the infamous Mujahideen was formed, as an effort to somewhat create a centralized resistance in order to fight the Soviets. So let us dive deeper into the strategies that allowed the Mujahideen to reign victorious over its much stronger opponent. In the war's initial stages, the Soviets succeeded in capturing cities and large popular centers. But the problem was that the Mujahideen had escaped to the countryside, where they were much harder to capture or kill. This decentralized type of fighting is what we call guerrilla warfare, and it allowed the Mujahideen to have mobility and unpredictability like no conventional army before its time. This rendered the largely mechanized Soviet forces helpless against ambushes and nighttime attacks. A Soviet paratrooper, Lieutenant Igor Orlov, stated, "The Mujahideen were like ghosts. They could appear and disappear at will. They were masters of guerrilla warfare, making full use of their rugged terrain and their mobility. It was a constant game of cat and mouse, but they always seemed to have the upper hand." It of course didn't help that the terrain of Afghanistan largely consisted of mountains and valleys. The terrain made it harder for supply and armored convoys to move without being exposed. And at the same time, it became challenging for the Soviet Air Force to spot and effectively attack their targets. Soviet pilots also had to worry about perhaps the biggest threat of all, shoulder-launched surface-to-air missiles, also known as MANPADS, such as the American Stinger, that were extensively used with great effect. In turn, the Soviet Air Force was forced to adapt their tactics around this threat, which hindered their operational capabilities and effectiveness even further. Global weapons aid, being mostly supplied by the US through Pakistan, helped the Mujahideen to obtain weapons and economical funding that also enabled them to keep up the fight. I'm very sure that the US won't regret that. Either way, this turned what was predicted to be a quick and decisive victory by the Soviets into a 9-year-long lasting stalemate. Eventually, due to the new Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev's foreign policy, the Soviets finally chose to withdraw from Afghanistan, putting an end to the 9-year-long conflict. But sadly, the story doesn't end here. Because of Soviet bombing of civilian areas, approximately 7 million people had to flee from their homes, therefore causing one of the biggest refugee crises the world has ever seen. The militant groups that were still left in the country after the war started forming into different coalitions that eventually started fighting with each other, in turn starting a civil war. Among these groups were the infamous Taliban and Al-Qaeda, who used their influence and new power to tax the local populations and also export opium. And this gave them the necessary funding to pursue their ideological goals on a larger scale. And as we all know, on September 11, 2001, Al-Qaeda launched their attacks on the World Trade Center, sparking the American War on Terror. The fall of the Soviet Union can also be partially attributed to the Soviet-Afghan War. The failure of the Soviet army to capture and secure Afghanistan led to widespread doubts about the military's effectiveness. And this military failure, combined with the significant economic strain caused by the prolonged conflict, eroded public confidence in the Soviet government's ability to lead effectively. As the war dragged on, the mounting casualties and expenses further destabilized the Soviet Union, contributing to its eventual collapse in 1991. As we look back at this war and truly make an effort to understand it, most of us probably realize just how devastating this conflict truly was. Not only for the individual soldiers, but also for the millions of people indirectly impacted by its events. And with that said, I hope that I've succeeded in teaching you about this bizarre yet equally historically important conflict.